Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film that examines Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis and the ways in which it impacts our communities, industries, and culture. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to produce this podcast series that will continue to explore issues facing the Louisiana coast through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. In this episode, we're speaking with Patty Ferguson-Bohnee. Patty is an attorney and the director of the Indian Legal Clinic at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. She is also a member of the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe. And now, our interview with Patty Ferguson-Bohnee.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Patty. So I know that you're currently based out of Arizona, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your Louisiana roots and what it was like for you growing up here as a member of the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I'm happy to speak with you about myself and my tribe and my community. I am from the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe, which is located in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes. And I, grew up with my family knowing that I was Native. And it was really interesting because I actually grew up in Zachary. Our parents wanted us to have educational opportunities. And the first year I started school, there was some realignment of the school lines. So we started in a different school than the district we were living. And at that school, it was the first year that they integrated the school. And so it was super interesting because there was a lot of focus on whether someone was African-American or Caucasian. And they didn't really focus on anything else. Like it was, you had to check this box of being Black or white. And myself and my siblings didn't fit within that box. So that was kind of interesting. But we spent a lot of time in Pointe-au-Chien. A lot of my family are fishermen. And, during the summers I was there, during the year, we went down there a lot. And it was just, a very fun childhood to be able to eat like really good seafood and to, have that sort of relationship with your family because we have a pretty close family.
Awesome. And what is the cultural significance of the land in South Louisiana for the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe? And why is it so important that they be in that location?
Yeah, so the area where our tribe is probably one of the oldest continuously habited areas in the state of Louisiana. Our ancestors have lived there since time immemorial. And when you look at Louisiana was growing land because of the Mississippi River. So the Bayou Pointe-au-Chien, where we live in that area, was always the land. There was freshwater flow that came through the Bayou Lafourche from the Mississippi River, all the tributaries there, which have now been blocked off whenever they levied up the Mississippi River. But that would bring new topsoil every year. There was fresh water, which flowed. And then, with levying that up and the discovery of oil and gas, that has changed the ecosystem and the environment. But the area is real. It's sacred to us. It's important to us. We have a lot of villages that have now been abandoned, but people still fish in these areas. We also have a lot of burial mounds and sacred sites in these areas that are at risk or have already been destroyed by the changes to the land or the destruction of the land through cutting through the land by oil and gas companies. But our people continue to live in this area. The medicinal plants have been very important to our communities. Living off the land has sustained us. So we were actually very self-sufficient in the 1940s, even the 50s. But as the land is changing, then you have to change the way that you live. And we haven't really had the tools to adapt to these drastic changes in the land.
Thank you for that explanation. And so I know you just touched on it a little bit, but how has the coastal land loss crisis affected the Native American populations in Louisiana and specifically Pointe-au-Chien, and how are they adapting to that?
Right. So, the land loss has been significant. So, Pointe-au-Chien is located in the fastest eroding basin in the United States. And that's because there's been value judgments made about what's important to protect, who we care about, and because there's been a focus on exploitation of resources without any regard of the future or for the people who live there, because people have discounted the value of tribal people and the resources, and they've elevated the exploitation of resources, or even just discovery of resources, or who can has the right to cut up land, even though that's our Aboriginal territory, and we've been living there and have been living there and maintain our presence in all of these areas. So that's been very detrimental, because there hasn't been a stewardship ethic by these other entities and people who have come in to exploit the land. And that has a ripple effect for our communities, but also for all of Louisiana. So, the land, a lot of the land where we used to live is no longer habitable. People can't live there. So there were actual villages where people live that have had to be abandoned, basically, because there wasn't any fresh water for people to drink. There's no fresh water for people to grow crops. There's no fresh water for the animals. So that's not a situation that's sustaining, or, and so because of that, we've basically been forced to resettle somewhere else and another part of the community. And so that's really unfortunate, but it also puts the whole community at risk, because we have salt water coming in and then the land being destroyed. So now we're basically the front line for any storm or hurricane, because we don't have these buffers that are further out that's slowing any wind event down, and then that's compounded by sea level rise. So whenever there's a hurricane, if we are on the wrong side of that hurricane and we get the sea level rise, then we've flooded. So for Katrina, we had a little bit of wind in 2005, but for Rita, we had 8 feet of water. Right. And so the same thing in 2008 with Gustav and Ike. Gustav was a wind event, and Ile-Jean-Charles next to us. So some houses were destroyed and houses were impacted. But with Ike in 2008, a few months later, we had 8 feet of water from these storm surges that could be in Lake Charles or in Texas. And that's, just because we're so vulnerable and we have no more barrier islands, there's no levees, and there's levee systems around us which are pushing water into our communities because it's finding a way where that water should be going. And then obviously in 2021 with Hurricane Ida, we took a direct hit from a Category 4 storm, which destroyed most of the homes in our community. So we had about 12 homes that were habitable. They were still damaged, but they were habitable. And so that was a significant event. So, the ability to live in safe housing, the access to water, resources, that's a challenge. But, the other thing that I don't know if people think about is like when we're having this land erode, it's also impacting our fisheries. And if everything opens up, where are the shrimp going to grow? Like the shrimp and crabs are in these inland waters. And so that's an important thing that I think everybody should think about. And, for us after the storm, most people stayed, like they haven't left. We had, I think, 2 families in Lower Pointe-au-Chien that have moved. One moved to Upper Pointe-au-Chien, one moved somewhere else closer to Mississippi. But even though most people's houses were destroyed, people were like, well, this is where I'm from. We have a responsibility to this land, to the people, and to our community. And most people have stayed, even if they're living in conditions that, aren't sustainable.
Wow. Yeah. So what has that recovery process been like from then to now? And like where does it stand now?
Yeah. So initially, after the storm, the tribal people from Pointe-au-Chien came in and cleaned the roads off. There was still water in the communities. The Pointe-au-Chien Bayou divides the community. One side is Lafourche Parish, one side is Terrebonne Parish, and neither parish really responded quickly or or was a priority. I mean, to the extent that the pumps weren't even running, there wasn't gas put in the pumps before the storm. So even though it wasn't a flood event for us, there was standing water that wasn't removed, which made it difficult for people to come in and try to salvage things. But after we did that, it was really people like from New Orleans or other areas who came out for months to help us clean up, which I'm saying is to help people go through items, see what needed to be, what they could keep, and then, help bring things to the road so that they could be picked up, because people didn't have water or electricity for, over a month down there, and then slowly people started getting some FEMA trailers. People are still in FEMA trailers today. Most of the people who live on the Lafourche side of the bayou don't qualify. There's a rebuilding program called LA Restore. But because our tribal people live on land that isn't divided fee simple for individuals, it's family property, and it's divided according to tribal custom, that people can't qualify for this LA Restore program. So we have one person who rebuilt their home on their own. We have another home that is in the process of being rebuilt with assistance from volunteers. But that is, about as far as we've made it. We have some people who have fixed their homes. We actually have two people who have rebuilt their homes, but some homes they're like, you wouldn't even know there was a home there, because the homes are gone. And right now the issue is that people have to raise their homes higher. So I think it's 14 feet. So if your pilings aren't 14 feet high, then you have to start anew at 14 feet. So a lot of people wanted to maintain a wall so that they wouldn't have to elevate that high. And there aren't a lot of resources coming into our community. And on the other side of the bayou, on the Terrebonne side, we have one family in Lower Pointe-au-Chien from our tribe who is in the process of getting a new house. And we hear that one other person up the bayou in Upper Pointe-au-Chien has been approved. So that's good, but it's really slow. So it's been over 2 years. And
yeah,
there hasn't been, like, we were trying to focus on a resilient rebuild process so that people, one, have strong roofs and their homes are strong so they can withstand wind events, because, once you go up, your house, what we think happened is that your house needs to be stronger to sustain the wind that it may, we say, catch because it's higher in the air. People just haven't had the resources to, adapt to these changing conditions where you have to have a stronger house to withstand these storms, which you are going to have more of a direct hit, because you're closer, you're basically like next to the Gulf because of, all the land loss.
wow. So yeah, it's still very much an ongoing recovery process, it seems like, but That's amazing that so many people stayed and are committed to staying.
Well, I mean, if your job is shrimping or oystering or crabbing, you kind of have to be next to the water or, near your
Right.
work. So it makes sense for people who are engaging in fisheries to, want to be next to where they work.
Right, absolutely. And so I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about some of the coastal restoration efforts and the organizations that you're involved with. I know you make trips frequently down to Louisiana. Tell me about some of what you're doing there.
Yeah, so we have a couple of really good partners who we've been working on various projects with. I will say that, it'd be great if there were larger projects that the government invested in, especially since they're responsible for allowing this destruction of the land, that they should, invest some funds into protection and restoration. And we have been advocating to be included in the master plan and to have projects from the master plan. This round of the master plan, there are a couple projects. And then I think the next question is whether they will be funded. So it's a whole thing, but if anybody has any influence, please get these projects funded because they're super important. In the meantime, we are very concerned about sacred sites and some of our burial mounds that are impacted by cuts that have been made in the bayou and in these areas that have really expanded to the point that some of these sacred sites, parts of them may be falling into the water, breaking off into the water. And so we have worked with CRCL on a living shoreline project using recycled oysters from people who eat at various restaurants in New Orleans. And then they treat those oysters where they have them set out in the sun so all the bacteria is removed. And then they're placed near some of these sacred sites. And we just finished one project. This is our third round working with CRCL. And so that just happened at the end of September. So now we've worked on one mound and then another mound site. That site still isn't completely covered. And the other mound, it's only one side of it that's covered, but it has reduced the amount of land loss in that area. You can see where there's oyster shells and where there's not oyster shells, just because everything is being accelerated because of the current and things that are opening up. So these are very important projects to us. We could probably work on these projects every weekend, because of the amount of need that there is. We've also been working with Glass Half Full to work on projects where they use recycled glass. So again, they work with different entities and people who recycle glass. They bring recycled glass, they clean it, and then they have different sizes of the glass that can be used to help fill in, especially some of these canals or different areas. And we had a pilot project next to our tribal building where there was a trenasse that was filled in. And one of the things we, had talked to them about is can life grow within this recycled grass so that things could grow? And that's a project I think that they're working on right now. And we have some future projects planned with them, just because there's so much need. And we really appreciate partners who ask us what our needs are, because our tribal members have the traditional knowledge to know where there's a need and where actually a project may work, versus people who come in and say, this is what you need. And then, or other people who start doing projects and we're like, that's not going to work, and it doesn't work, and you've invested a lot of resources, and it's not really what is wanted or needed in the tribal community. So I can say those two partners have worked really well with us. And then we've also worked with Sea Grant to really look at resiliency factors and risk factors in our community, because after the BP oil spill, there was some scoping projects because the state received a lot of money and penalties and fines and things of that nature through the NERDA process. And we really wanted to make sure that our voice was heard, but we got a lot of run around, and I went to the scoping meeting, and we were advocating for different projects in our community. And the state told us that the science doesn't support projects in our area. So basically, they're like just giving up on our area. And that was one of the reasons we weren't, I think, in the master plan also initially. But I think if you really cared about an area, that you would, invest in some projects in that area, and you find a way to make it work. We can see the areas that are super protected, they're protected for a reason. And the ones that aren't, where a lot of this land loss is, you may have like our tribal community, but you have other tribal communities who are at risk. So obviously we're not valued or protected. But we went to that meeting and they said that, and I was like, really like, oh, I don't have a response because I don't have any science, and you don't recognize our traditional knowledge or what our knowledge is and what we know could be done. So we actually worked with Sea Grant using our traditional knowledge and meshing that with Western knowledge. And there's a paper, it's called Mapping Risk Factors, to show where some of these spoil banks are near our mounds, that those are actually areas that are resilient, where if there were a project that could be sustaining, or where there are areas where they may not work as well. But really looking at this to kind of combat a general blanket statement that we can't do projects in your area. So I think that's really important, to use the traditional knowledge, which they took a lot of time. Like, we've been working with them before, I think it was, I can't remember. And also another university out of New Orleans, I think it was UNO, but really mapping through TEK all of these areas, and then taking that data and then providing resources so that community can use it to basically advocate for our interests.
Okay, very interesting. So it's better to be part of the conversation from the beginning to kind of foster that collaboration, it sees.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it makes a lot more sense to say, hey, what can you offer? What are our needs? Can we work together on a project so that we're listening to each other? Because sometimes researchers come to a tribal community and they're just like, I know what I want my outcome to be, and I just need, a guinea pig to do it, without really understanding what the needs are of the community, and whether, even if you're successful, is that going to benefit this community? Because you're just, trying something to benefit your research so you can write a paper or do something like that. But
yeah,
you need practical solutions. And if it benefits you by writing a paper, but if you write that paper and then there's more support for it, because then people are like, oh, this can happen, it could help other communities, well, then that's important.
Right. So lastly, I wanted to ask you about, I know that you're not only a member of the Pointe-au-Chien Indian Tribe, you're also an attorney for them. And I wanted to ask you about the fight for federal recognition for the tribe, and why that's so important, and what are the challenges to getting that done.
Yes, indeed. Well, we have been fighting for federal recognition since the 90s, and it really started in response to our need to protect the land. And what's happened is because of policies in the state of Louisiana, and because people have had to move from our Aboriginal land, Some companies have come in to exploit the land. One time there was a company that went and tried to cut through one of our burial mounds, and then people from the tribe went out with guns and said, you better leave. These are, you're not going to cut through our ancestors. And then in the 90s, there was this issue between one of the oil companies who are claiming that they have paper title through the Swamplands Act. So basically, whenever Louisiana became, the state of Louisiana, the U.S. passed the Swamplands Act and allegedly gave the land to the state of Louisiana. And then whatever, they were supposed to drain the land for beneficial use. And I would argue that cutting up land and allowing salt water to come in is not draining the land for beneficial use. But these entities obtain these paper titles. But what they did was, we had people who were fishing, or they had camps. We call them camps. That's where you live or fish and hunt. And they're trying to kick our tribal people off of these, out of these areas where they were trapping or fishing or living. And so our tribal members responded with an Aboriginal land title claim in federal district court. And this case was filed in the Eastern District of Louisiana, which is in New Orleans. And the judge there said, well, I can't determine this case until the federal government decides whether or not you should be federally recognized, which is not true. Like, you can have Aboriginal title without being federally recognized. But it just, made us see even clearer, hey, we need to fight for federal recognition. And what I will say is that our tribal people weren't allowed to go to attend school until the late 1960s. So we didn't have even an elementary school until the 30s. But once people went to elementary school, they didn't have a high school to go to, because there wasn't an investment by, the state or the parishes to provide that education. Again, that's really saying we don't care about you. We don't want you to be educated. But, these entities and people have taken advantage of that lack of education. So if you don't have education until late 1960s, you don't know that, I should be doing something to try to secure or protect this land, because this is just where we're living. This is ours. And it's recognized as such because no one's bothering us. But when the oil and gas companies start coming in and they're doing this and they're trying to kick people off, then the tribal people are like, no, this isn't going to happen. We're going to fight for this. And at the same time, there was a bill to recognize another tribe in Louisiana in exchange for all land claims, which would have included our land claims, even though we wouldn't have been recognized. And so it was good because the tribe spoke out. They're like, we really need to formalize, because we're really a kinship-based system. We really need to formalize and organize so that we can fight against this. And so that was in the mid 90s. And so I'm just like a young person. I'm in college at this time, and all these things are happening. And I didn't realize that my tribe wasn't federally recognized, or even what that meant, until I went to college. And we've really been trying to work on federal recognition since then. The lack of federal recognition really impedes our rights to self-determination and impedes our ability to respond after a storm. It impedes, our ability to, advocate for the land. Like if there's something else like BP, it prevented us receiving direct aid after the storm, or working directly with FEMA to protect our homes, our ancestral lands, our traditional sites, our sacred sites. It also impacts our collective rights to land, subsistence, our cultural identity. And so we've really been fighting for this. Like, one of the real issues in Louisiana is that you haven't had historians or other researchers really relying on primary resources to write histories about Louisiana tribes, because it kind of skips from the early French period to sometime after the U.S. is in Louisiana. So there are these gaps. And so we've been working on those gaps and trying to produce documentation that we should be submitting to the U.S. government, hopefully within the next year. But that process takes a really long time. So we first submitted in the 90s when all of this was happening. And, there's tribes who've been in the process for 30 years. And you have to have experts across the board. You have to have historians, you have to have lawyers, you have to have genealogists, you have to have anthropologists, and you have to produce all kinds of information that you would never even know exists.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for giving us all this information and taking the time to talk to me today, Patty. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it also.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Patty Ferguson-Bohnee. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can also watch a video version of this podcast on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through grant funds from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.